Uh, we're in business.
All right. Good evening, afternoon, or good night, wherever you are joining in from. We thank you so much. You are tuning into the first part of a three-part lecture series called Resetting the Table, Common Purpose Conversations. In this one specifically, we are going to be exploring the history of multiracial coalitions, and then we'll kind of briefly touch on a little bit of the backlash that comes from that. This is the Institute for Common Power. We are the educational arm of our larger organization called Common Power. And then this is just a brief overview of some of the things that we do. So Common Power mobilizes voters and helps create voting justice across the country. If you follow any of the social media pages, you've seen different efforts of door knocking. Most recently, yesterday, we had groups of educator ambassadors that were hosting registration drives for the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But we are representing the Institute for Common Power today as the educational arm. We offer lectures, workshops, learning tours where we go down south to Georgia and Alabama and we learn where the history happened. We also offer lots of other items and we'll talk about some of those things this afternoon or this evening as we wrap up. First things first, I'm Ivory Kennedy Jr. I am from Columbus, Ohio. I'm a program manager at I'm an education program manager at The Ohio State University, where I help future teachers achieve their dreams. And I'm also 1/3 of the Educator for Democracy team here within the Institute. And I will pass it to Dr. Geary.
Thank you so much, Ivory. My name is Dr. Devin Geary. Just call me Devin. I work with the Institute for Common Power. I have for 3 years now. I'm a senior program manager, and I really focus on how we can better communicate about and across our differences in terms of race and ideology. And I'm exploring more about multiracial coalitions, and so you'll get to see some of that work this evening. But thrilled to be here and honored to get to partner with Ivory on this.
Yes, likewise. Likewise. So again, this is the first of three. So hopefully you join us the next two Thursdays, so the 14th and the 21st. And we're going to be talking about some of the history that we've never really reckoned with. So just to give you a little bit of overview of what you're going to see for the next two sessions, we're going to be dissecting different understandings of truth. We live in an information environment that is very robust, and not all of that information is truthful, and we see how damaging that can be. So we'll take a deep dive into some of those different truths that we see. And then we want to end on a positive note. So in our third and final session, we are hoping to build bridges and give you all tools, and hopefully you all can give us some tools as well on how to have conversations across differences. Is one of Devin's favorite terms, is having conversations across differences, and it's very effective so that we can have some sort of collective action. All right. So going forward, this is today's agenda. Talk about some notable multiracial coalitions from the 19th century into the early 20th century, and talk about those interracial dynamics. And then again, the mid to late 20th century, and then talk about some contemporary ideologies or instances where we see multiracial coalitions coming together. And one of the things that we want you to think about, what has impeded us from working together in the past? And how can we utilize that awareness in coalitions today? Now, I'm not going to read everything on every slide, but that question is very important. And I'm a big note taker. I have my pen and paper here. So if you all have any type of mechanism where you are taking notes, we offer you to do that just because we want you to walk away with lots of information. So with that being said, we are going to jump straight in. I have a clip from James Baldwin. This is from 1963, and I want you to think about all of what was happening in 1963 at that point in time. All right. What all is happening in 1963 at this point in time? I'm going to play this, and then we're going to talk about it.
Most of the white Americans I've ever encountered, really, had a Negro friend or a Negro maid or somebody in high school, but they never, or rarely, but after school was over or whatever, came to my kitchen. We were segregated from the schoolhouse door. Therefore, he doesn't know. He really does not know what it was like for me to leave my house, leave school and go back to Harlem. He doesn't know how Negroes live. And it comes as a great surprise to the Kennedy brothers and to everybody else in the country. I'm certain, again, that like most white Americans I have, encountered, they have no No, I'm sure they have nothing whatever against Negroes. That's really not the question. The question is really a kind of apathy and ignorance, which is a price we pay for segregation. That's what segregation means. You don't know what's happening on the other side of the wall because you don't want to know.
Mr. Baldwin, I'm going to have to interrupt here for just a moment. We'll be back with more.
All right. So I want you to hold on to some of the things that he said, and I'm going to go back to that. But we want to make sure that you are situated with the vocabulary for a lot of what we are going to be discussing today. Again, I'm not going to read all of these, brought to you by Merriam-Webster. I do want to focus on what he's talking about in terms of segregation and what that means. So I will read this one. The institutional separation of an ethnic, racial, religious, or other minority group from the dominant majority. Now, going back to what Baldwin was saying, he said, I don't think that everyone has something against me, but what happens when we are so separated? What happens when we are so separated in terms of how do we understand a lived experience? How do we value someone's lived experience? If someone has experienced something that I can never really identify with, but yet I don't have any type of context of why they might have dealt with that in the first place, it might turn me off to someone's pain, right? So I want you to really, truly think about what segregation has done to us from the very beginning of this country, especially right now, right? Not to get too into the weeds of what's happening today, but there was a town in Arkansas that there are people that are creating a white town just for them, right? I think we tried that already as a nation, and something about that just didn't mix. All right. So for the rest of the vocabulary, I want you to take a look, right? We have integration, abolition, indigenous, we have power, resistance, rebellion. All of these words are going to play a role in today's lecture. So these are what we want you to be able to center yourself around. Okay. So we are going to take a dive into what our multiracial coalitions kind of started from. I'm a former history teacher, so bear with me. This will be a little bit of a history lesson. But as Dr. Scott says, history is our self-help book, right? And sometimes history rhymes, right? It doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And we might be in one of those rhymes right now. So let's talk about Bacon's Rebellion. Okay, this is going to happen pre the United States of America. So these are still colonies in 1676 in Jamestown, Virginia, the very first settlement that is going to make waves and kind of lay the foundation for what we now know as America. So Bacon's Rebellion, okay, this is just a depiction of that. You have Nathaniel Bacon, who was a poor white frontiersman, somebody who is going west to try to make sure that they can create this land of opportunity and belief that they came here for in the first place. All right. He's going to lead poor white frontiersmen like him, as well as enslaved Africans, in a revolt against colonial elites. At the foundation of this country, power was centralized. You had to be a land-owning white male, and those were basically the qualifications. Realizing that that was not fair, right? I want you to think about the idea of what fairness is. You have somebody that is willing to not necessarily look at things in terms of racial dynamics, but this power dynamic. So they said, you know what? Let's fight about it. Okay. So what are some of these causes? You have lack of land, right? Because you could only have land if you were wealthy enough to do so. Taxes, right? The idea of no taxation without representation comes a little bit later and is formalized a lot later. But the idea of you telling me that I have to pay something, but I don't get a say in that, which leads into the political power. All of this is going to create a great deal of angst and frustration, and rightfully so, right? I would be upset if I didn't have an appropriate amount of representation either, especially seeing the amount of wealth that's happening. And this is pre-cotton, right? These are more tobacco farmers, right? The cotton industry is slowly but surely turning. And then another cause is going to be the anger over the Governor Berkeley. And I want you to remember his name should you join us next session. But Governor Berkeley refused to retaliate against the indigenous, the native groups, right? So the idea that this is racial towards Black folk is wrong. You have indentured servants and you have enslaved African Americans that are willing to join with white people, indentured servants and poor white people. The race is not a factor for them. However, it did become that issue with the natives, right? Nonetheless, you have people coming together. This is a moment of multiracial labor solidarity, because why should I work so hard for so little? and it is rooted in this colonial violence, right? We are going to take down the rulers of this place, the colonialists. So again, you have poor people uniting across race against elite control. People set aside the things that they could see and their lived experiences and what they united on. All right. So again, going back to one of my favorite documents in the world, the Declaration of Independence. Okay. However, there was a passage that is going to be omitted. Thomas Jefferson included this, and the founders about had a heart attack because they couldn't believe that you would include this. And it wrote, "He, King George, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or incur miserable death in their transportation thither." As I used to tell my 8th graders, okay, so what is he saying, right? He is blaming the king, King George, for the idea and the institution of slavery, while he has enslaved people himself. If we were to include this in the Declaration of Independence, how different would our country have ended up? And I want you to really think about, how did you learn the Declaration of Independence yourself? Was this something that you were taught? And if not, why? If this could have and almost made it in our founding document, then why isn't this something that we talk about quite often? Because slavery is going to continue for quite some time after that. All right. And again, this is pre his presidency. This comes from one of his journal entries as well. This is a couple years later. And this is what he writes. He said, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest." And what is that contest? It's slavery, the practice and the continued practice of slavery. Now, some of this is spoken like a true abolitionist, right? Thomas Jefferson is a very contradicting figure, but some of what he had to say about slavery was legitimate, right? Because it was the idea that human bondage is wrong. And he knew that. And he said that he knew that God knew that that was wrong and that it wouldn't last. So what happened, right? It continued, but the question is why? And why aren't we taught this side of the coin too? Because this actually happened. These are his writings. This is a primary source, okay? So moving into the 1800s, lots of this happens in Virginia, okay? A man by the name of Gabriel Prosser, all right? He's an enslaved blacksmith. He's incredibly smart, okay? He's incredibly smart and he's literate. He is going to plan one of the largest slave revolts in the South at that time, believed to be at the South at that time. And it was inspired by the Haitian Revolution that lasted from 1791 up through 1804. All right. The goals of this rebellion. And again, this is a very massive effort. So you have the same kind of people, those poor indentured servant, those poor white folks that are in Virginia as well that can't get jobs because, number one, free labor for African bodies that are African and African American bodies. But number two, they don't have the same opportunity, right? So there's more in common that they share than opposite. Now, the goals of this were to end slavery in the colony, to overthrow Virginia's elite and kidnap the governor, who was Governor Monroe, James Monroe, who turns out to be the 5th president. And he was also a slave owner. Okay. And then the goal was to build a more equal society for all. Now, you could think that an enslaved Black person has every right to say, I want this for me and me only because this is my plight. I am the one that's struggling. But they say we want an equal society for all. Again, you have a moment of solidarity that is going to transcend race and it's all about the circumstance. So it's another example of how a lived experience can overcome the idea of race. We're not dismissing race at all, right? That would be me ignoring my existence. Can't do that. However, I have enough in me to say, I won't let that get in the way, especially if that means we can all benefit from something. So again, another instance where poor people can unite across race against elite control. Okay. Now, if this was regular class, I would say, what do we think about this picture? So I want you to take a few seconds, right? Take a few silent seconds and really dissect some of the things that are in this picture. Okay, so I'm going to do a teacher 30 seconds, and we're going to look at this picture and kind of point out some of the different things that you see. I guess I could use my little timer that's right here in my face. All right. So hopefully you got some things going on. There's maybe 5 things that stood out to me, right? You got the American flag on one side and you have the Confederate flag, battle flag on another. If you look closely, I don't know if my mouse will show. If you look closely, you can see what appears to be African Americans, an African American woman that might be holding a child, right? You have the depiction of African Americans below here. You have fire in the background, right? John Brown, this man in the middle, though, he looks like a divine and godly figure, though, right? I believe what he's holding in his hand is a rifle in one hand and the Bible in the other. And he's much larger than all of those, right? And in a lot of cases, John Brown is larger than life at some point. But did you really learn about John Brown? Okay, so let's talk about him. Born in 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut. For a second, I want you to think about the location of his birth in relation to the cause that he fought for. And that cause is going to ultimately be ending slavery in the United States. He was in opposition of the expansion of slavery. He had every right to utilize the privilege that he is born with, being in the Northeast of the United States, and probably could have lived his life not having to worry anything about what was happening in the Deep South, as well as the expansion in the Western Territory of the United States. So what makes him different? What was it that did it for him to say, I'm willing to put my life on the line for this just cause? Well, this is where family comes in, right? Our family is very important. How we are raised has a lot to do with what we and how we interpret the world. So he's raised in a deeply religious and abolitionist family. His father supported the Underground Railroad, and he was a strict opponent of slavery. All right. So you don't have to be of any color or creed to be against something that is wrong. And that is going to be the challenge, the overarching challenge for all of us after this lecture and even tomorrow, whatever your daily life looks like. How do you channel in some ways whatever that John Brown spirit could be? Okay. He lived in Ohio, hey, great state of Ohio, and Kansas, where he witnessed violence about slavery, especially bleeding Kansas or bloody Kansas. So that is going to be a battle that is kind of the first shot of the Civil War. We don't really talk about it that way, but that is going to be the first really, really huge instance of violence as it relates to the expansion of slavery. Now, my favorite part maybe about John Brown is that he believed that it was a moral evil and that it had to be destroyed by force, not words or politics. Obviously, we go on to fight a civil war to end the institution of slavery. And years before that, what did Thomas Jefferson say? He said the same thing, this religious ideology that this was not going to be able to withstand the just due of the Almighty, right? So you have 2 people. One guy is saying that and is putting his life on the line for it in John Brown. You have another guy that's written it a couple times and spoken about it and congratulated Congress for banning the slave trade and also enslaved people. So what's that about, right? However, John Brown, right? Let's not make it about anybody else. He saw himself as an instrument of divine justice. What would the United States be like? What would it have been like? What can it be like if more people saw themselves as a John Brown, willing to get in the way, to forego whatever privilege that they have, right? There are certain privileges that we all have. I have certain privileges being a man, right? There are certain privileges that exist for all of us. He set that aside to cause some damage. All right, so let's get into Harper's Ferry. So this is 1859. So how old is John Brown? 59 years old. He is going to lead a well-planned raid. It took place on an armory in Virginia. And his plan was to seize weapons and give them to African Americans, as well as those he had recruited for this rebellion. He had had enough, and he said, you know what? I'm going to do something about it. So he did. So this is about a group of over 20 men. You have runaway enslaved people. You have free African Americans. You have college students. And what I think is the most dignifying thing of all is that he instilled in his sons the same type of need for justice. So 3 of his sons are actually going to join him. Okay. They're going to join him for this fight. This is not only an example of a multiracial coalition coming together to resist the institution of slavery at the federal level, but this is in the name of religion, righteousness, and sacrifice. And we'll talk about what those ultimate sacrifices were in our second session. But right now, look at how these things came together. What I am going to implore all of you to do with all of this history, right? This happened at a time where there was no phones, there was no social media, there was no way for the word to be passed the way that it is right now. There was no calling, nothing like that. But people were willing to get together, fight a common fight to end something that was wrong. I don't think any of us would trade places with anybody who was once enslaved. I know my lineage, my personal lineage. I know that lineage to slavery. It is mind-blowing that I didn't learn all about this in this way. Because what would happen if there were children all across the United States? Think about your own schooling experience. If you would have learned that there were a lot of different ways that people tried to intervene with the institution of slavery. What if you would have learned that Thomas Jefferson, as great of a president as he was for the expansion of the United States, he knew that slavery was wrong? Why aren't we taught that? And how is it that people today still believe that there is some sort of need to keep this kind of history suppressed? Okay, so think about that. I will turn it over to Dr. Geary.
Thank you so much, Ivory. And I want to start off by echoing your last point, which is the impact. What would the impact be if we would have learned about some of these incredible folks, these thought of radicals who challenged those in power, these multiracial coalitions? How inspiring would that be? How much would that kind of bolster us to believe that we too can rise up against those in power who are trying to keep us all down, and see these struggles as all of our struggles? So you can go ahead and hit the next.
Devin, I have a question. I have a point. I have a question for you before you.
Okay, good. Go for it.
In Florida, I think this maybe was last year. There's so many educational standards changing. There is an effort to sanitize and say that there was a benefit of slavery, or that the slavery was good, right? There was this conversation that, enslaved people didn't necessarily have a problem. Like if they ran away, that they must have been mentally ill. That can't necessarily hold up to these kind of truths. So my question to you is, how did you learn about any of this? And you might have an answer now, you might not, but how did you learn from where you are from about these kinds of instances of resistance, or did you?
Wonderful question, Ivory. And I had to seek them out. I had to seek them out as an adult. I learned, I'm sure, as many people on the call, my extent of understanding around the civil rights movement was that Rosa Parks sat down and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood up. And that's what I was taught. Without, we as a society, the mainstream society wants to ensure that people have a positive belief and kind of positive thinking around the United States and its history. But in doing so, we fail to acknowledge the truth of our history. And so I think it's the fact that, different states are trying to whitewash their history, are telling their students lies, is incredibly harmful. It's incredibly harmful. And we have an opportunity with the bad, with the awful. There is also this incredible resilience and this resistance and these rebellions. And those have an opportunity to inspire folks. And we miss out on those when we don't talk about the reality of what happened. How about you? When did you learn about it?
Uh, I was blessed to have a Black woman from Mississippi as my teacher, Miss Trials,
Mm,
from fourth through sixth grade. And we touched on some of that, but it wasn't until eighth grade, Mr. Reisner, who is key to my existence as a teacher, he showed us the movie Roots at eighth grade. And Mr. Reisner is a white guy. And he had to do a lot of damage control because we were so angry. But he uplifted the struggles, he uplifted the resilience, he uplifted the truth about what it took for us to become where we were at that time. And it just so happened that I'm telling my age here, but when we were in eighth grade, that's when President Obama was elected.
mm,
So we go from seeing Roots and hating the United States because of what happened to a lot of us to then seeing this happen at that election. So eighth grade, I was fortunate to have really good teachers. So from eighth grade on, it was always a fire that stayed burning, and that's kind of what led me to end up teaching history, even though I said I'd never be a teacher. But here I am. So I was fortunate. But
mhm.
I just wonder how much damage is done, how much time is lost when we don't have teachers like that. But again, that's what these moments, these spaces are for, and that's what we are hoping to inspire. So cool.
Absolutely.
Right.
All right, so I'm going to get into talking about some of the racial dynamics of what we consider to be kind of the mainstream abolition movement. And I warn you now, a lot of what I'm going to say is critical, and it's critical towards white people. But I wanted to start off by kind of repeating a bit of what Ivory was saying in terms of the fact that there were people in our history who gave their lives, who put it all on the line, both white and black, in order to fight for what they believed to be right. So one example of many, Ivory has just talked about John Brown. I'm going to briefly touch on talking about Charles Turner Torrey, who's on the left, and Thomas Smallwood. Torrey was a white abolitionist who died in prison for freeing enslaved people. He and Smallwood worked together, and over you know decades were able to free hundreds of enslaved people. And it cost Torrey his life. Smallwood had to flee to the north. He had to flee to Canada. But this is another example of people who recognizing a moral wrong, a grave injustice, put it all on the line across race. All right, we can go on to the next. All right, but I do want to talk a bit about the challenges, the pitfalls in terms of interracial dynamics of what we consider the mainstream abolitionist movement from 1830 to 1870. This is the abolitionist movement a lot of folks talk about, even though there was resistance and rebellions and uprisings from Africans and African Americans from the beginning, from the inception of enslavement. But with the abolitionist movement, we see we've got key figures like Frederick Douglass in the bottom left-hand corner there, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, William Lloyd Garrison, and sisters Angelina and Sarah Grimke. And these are whites and blacks coming together to give speeches, to implore people, often morally, to make the decision that enslavement was wrong and to free people. But white and black abolitionists had very different ideas about how this should be done. So, first, despite the fact that many black abolitionists had actually lived through enslavement, and so you would think that they would get to call the shots in terms of what should be done, how it should be done. They were often denied positions of leadership in interracial abolitionist movements, and they had to fight for their voices to be heard. And many whites in these organizations took patronizing positions toward black abolitionists. although white abolitionists were opposed to slavery, that still meant that they still held racist views. And their belief in Black inferiority was very evident in their behaviors, their speeches, their writings. They were very condescending towards Black people, all the while pressing for their freedom. So, as one example, many white abolitionists believe that they knew what was best and they advocated for gradualism, which was the slow and gradual emancipation of enslaved people. And they also advocated for colonization, sending Black people back to Africa. And many Black Americans, many Black abolitionists disagreed with both of these perspectives heartily and advocated for immediate emancipation because they saw how horrific enslavement was. And they said something needs to be done now. And they also advocated for integration into American society. We've been here. This is our country now, too. We should be able to be a part of the fabric of society. So there are actually accounts of white and Black abolitionists demanding from white abolitionists who were raising money to send Black people back to Africa to use that money instead to support furthering Black education in the States. Another key difference between white and Black abolitionists and the mainstream movement was that while many white abolitionists focused solely on eradicating slavery, Black abolitionists were also fighting for racial equality and justice. And racial equality, as I said, was something that wasn't a part of this mainstream abolitionist movement. There are accounts of abolitionists like Frederick Douglass describing being objectified, being treated as a prop when he was asked to share his story of enslavement to an audience. So he'd be orating, he would be telling his story, and then he'd begin to share some thoughts and philosophy regarding emancipation and equality. And he'd hear white folks deterring him, telling him, just tell your story, Frederick. Just give us the facts. We'll take care of the philosophy. Like, how patronizing is that? They also told him it was best if he didn't sound too smart and that he should use the quote plantation manner of speaking because it better fit the narrative that they had of Black people needing white people to free them. Patricia Hill Collins is a scholar. She's written books on intersectionality and Black feminist thought, and she uses this really great term, controlling images, to describe how in society, dominant groups perpetuate stereotypes, and then they try to restrict and relegate the subject to those very stereotypes, saying this is all you can do. You can't do anything else. And then when they see those individuals in those positions or acting in ways that reinforce their stereotypes, they utilize that opportunity to go, aha, see, I told you. That was all this individual was capable of. So making Douglass act in certain ways was meant to confirm audience stereotypes, their limits in their minds about what they believed him capable of, which restricted both Douglass and the audience members from being able to learn how complex, how intellectual, how much brilliance this man had. All right, go on, you can hit the next one. So another example of a controlling image is if you look at this emblem of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Although with the AASS, the American Anti-Slavery Society, although Black abolitionists helped found the organization and were early members and organizers, the leadership was mostly white. And in this photo, you can see it's an enslaved man, and he's not in an empowered or leading position, but he's kneeling and asking for help. In other depictions, he's specifically asking for help from a white man. And this is a controlling image, right? It is limiting, it is stereotyping of the Black community in the very same kind of sentence as they're trying to free enslaved African Americans. So one of the main leaders of AASS was William Lloyd Garrison. He's in the center, and he originally believed in gradualism and colonization, but he changed both of these views after listening to a Black abolitionist, James Forten on the right, and others. But Forten helped fund Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, which published many articles by Black abolitionists. And Liberator also included articles advocating for women's suffrage, which is what I want to talk about next. So I include these women as the first page of the women's suffrage movement because when we talk about it in society, these are often not the folks that we focus on. So this is Mary Church Terrell on the far left. Then we've got Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who we'll talk about in a second, then Ida B. Wells, then Mabel Ping Hua Lee, and Zitkala Sa at the end there. So these were suffragists, but their stories and their names often get buried because we often hear about white suffragists and their efforts to fight for the women's right to vote. Okay. So in the abolitionist movement, Black and white women had been largely barred from leadership roles. Their contributions were essential as organizers and speakers and writers and fundraisers, but they were largely relegated to supporting roles. So this was one of many factors that led to the women's suffrage movement. And this was really an opportunity of women of all races, of all classes, to come together and collaborate, to see a common cause. Black and white women were speaking on the same stages to advocate for women's suffrage. But it became quite clear that white women were prioritizing white women's suffrage. White women enforced segregation within the movement and perpetuated stereotypes against Black men in their kind of desire to get the vote first. And we see this especially after the Civil War, when the suffrage movement fractured over the issue of the 15th Amendment, which would grant Black men the right to vote, but not women. And as it got closer to passing, the racism of white leaders of the National Women's Suffrage Association, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's pictured here, and Susan B. Anthony, often the women who we as a society kind of lift up and think of as the leaders of the movement, despite all of the efforts of these women of color who were also a part of the suffrage movement. But the racism of these two leaders became increasingly apparent. And this was not something that I learned about when I first learned about the women's rights movement. I saw these women as icons, and then realized later the racism that they had utilized and how they had prioritized their race over their sex. So they utilized racist stereotypes, slurs, and tropes. They said that white women would be in physical danger if Black men got the right to vote, even though history has shown that it's very much the other way around. But it was all an attempt to try and get the vote for white women first. And Black women did not hesitate to push back and urge white women to seek unity with Black women and Black people, yes, but also to call them out on their racism and on their injustice and on the missed opportunity of forming a coalition for change. So in May 1866, and you can go into the next one because it's going to have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. In May 1866, at the National Women's Rights Convention in New York City, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper shared a speech titled, "We Are All Bound Up Together." And she did not mince words in this speech. And I've just pulled sections of it. She said, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity." She's emphasizing that the opportunity, how we are interdependent on each other, and the opportunity to come together and work together. But she criticizes white women because of their racism. She says, "I do not believe that giving the women the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that, like men, they may be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles, the bad as dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question, with the winning party. You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white women of America." She says this on a national stage, standing next to white leaders of this women's suffrage movement. As it's just very, very powerful in 1866. And these are words of frustration after white women in the movement had failed to be a part of this so promising coalition. The last thing I'll say about this is that Black women like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, they go on to found their own organizations like the National Association of Colored Women with the motto, and I love this, it's very poignant, lifting as we climb. They fought for women's suffrage, but they also fought against racism and discrimination. What they were not seeing from their white counterparts, unfortunately. All right, so I've gone the negative. That's some failed examples of solidarity and coalition building across race. But let's look at a positive example. Let's talk about the Wobblies. So the Wobblies is a nickname from the industrial workers of the world, the IWW. I'm sure many of you are familiar. A labor union that still exists today and operates across the country and the world. And their motto was, very similar to lifting as we climb, their motto was and continues to be, an injury to one is an injury to all. If only we believed that way as a society, we would be so much better off. So in the early 20th century, many unions kept the Black and white workers that they were organizing separate, and they restricted leadership positions to white workers. But the Wobblies were committed to being interracial and egalitarian. One group of Wobblies specifically, the Local 8, was the union's most racially inclusive branch. It had the largest contingent of African Americans, and its most influential leader was Ben Fletcher, who you can see in the left-hand corner up top. If you don't know about Ben Fletcher, I hugely recommend doing some research on this man. He should be considered one of the greats in terms of organizing, but he, like many other people of color who did incredible things throughout our history, their stories have been buried, and we must unearth them. So he was just an incredible orator, used a lot of humor. Sometimes his humor got him into a little bit of trouble, and he had to kind of skip town for a minute and come back because he would be very honest. But so he was the leader of Local 8. And Local 8 organized longshoremen who were loading and unloading ships on the Philadelphia waterfront. And they needed a union because this was absolutely brutal and agonizing work. Shifts could last 2 to 3 days. If you stopped, you were easily replaced. It was very dangerous work. People regularly got injured and even died, and the pay was very poor. And racism was exacerbating these issues because there was no solidarity amongst the workers to hold effective work strikes so that they weren't able to negotiate with their employers. And employers utilized that. They perpetuated this racism and xenophobia, and they would split workers into separate racial and ethnic work groups so that they could pit them against each other. Local 8 changed the Philadelphia waterfront. The union demanded that the longshoremen work in integrated groups, which began to kind of reduce that racism, because when we come together and we have conversations, it challenges our stereotypes about each other. That's a kind of a light positive way of looking at it, but that's in part why they brought people together, so that if they worked in integrated groups, they could begin to form solidarity. And they also mandated that the union's leadership and social events were racially integrated. And Local 8 issued buttons to its members, and white and Black workers would walk off of a shift if non-union members without a button were hired to demonstrate, they would walk off if somebody was hired without a button in order to demonstrate their collective power and direct action. They wanted to show, if you hire somebody who's not a part of, who hasn't agreed to this solidarity, we're not going to work for you. And they were such a force that they were able to win wage increases and improve their working conditions. All right, now I want to jump forward to the 1960s, the civil rights movement. So in 1960, this is SNCC. Maybe I bet a lot of you have heard of him, maybe not. This is a pretty incredible interracial coalition. In 1960, Black college students staged a sit-in at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. And this act incited sit-ins across southern states. People saw what was happening in North Carolina and thought, this is a way. This is the direct action we need to fight back against segregation. SNCC principles were nonviolence, empowering local Black communities, direct action, and voter registration. And how they came together was that a leader of the civil rights movement, Ella Baker, noticed these sit-ins, and she gathered some of the young Black activists who'd participated, and she told them, do not join the existing Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I want you to create your own group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that's what they became, students, youth leaders. And they gained notoriety for many things, but one thing was participating in the Freedom Rides. So another organization, CORE, which was also interracial, the Congress of Racial Equality, had started the Freedom Rides, what were called the Freedom Rides, to test the enforcement of federal laws banning segregation in bus terminals. And when CORE decided to stop because they were experiencing so much violence as they were trying to enforce as they were trying to desegregate these bus terminals as had been laid out per law, they experienced so much violence that they said, you know what, we have to stop. We can't do this. And SNCC said, this young group of activists said, you can't stop because of violence. It sends the wrong message. And they took over the Freedom Rides. And so you can see in the top left-hand corner here, John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, younger, and Jim Zwerg, who were brutally beaten at a bus station in Montgomery, Alabama. So SNCC was a multiracial coalition of people who truly risked their lives for racial equality and justice. So this kind of harkens back to those groups that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture, who came together and saw moral wrongs and decided to put their bodies on the line, put their lives on the line, to make a more just and equitable society. So SNCC's most extensive organizing efforts were in Mississippi when they, in 1964, launched Freedom Summer, known as the Mississippi Summer Project. And it was an initiative to register Black voters in Mississippi, to set up freedom schools to teach Black history, civics, and literacy, to establish community centers, and to challenge the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party. And a big part of Freedom Summer was inviting white Northerners to travel to Mississippi to join this work. And at the beginning of SNCC, whites never exceeded 20% of membership. And Freedom Summer would change that ratio dramatically because 1,000 predominantly white volunteers were going to be traveling to the South for the summer to work with SNCC. So there was a lot of debates about whether or not this should happen. So the organizers, the leaders really weighed the pros and cons. And that's what we've got on this next slide. So should they bring whites, predominantly whites, to the South? Some pros. They knew that if they brought this huge amount of white students down to the South, that it would attract national media attention to the work that they were trying to do. They knew that it would increase the likelihood that the government would respond to acts of violence. And we saw that after the killings of 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. There was national recognition. And as they were looking for the bodies of those 3 men, 2 of which were white, they found the bodies of many African Americans. And it goes to show that their whiteness is what brought that type of attention and brought that kind of concern. So it definitely increased government response to acts of violence. White volunteers also had access to resources and networks. They were going to Ivy League schools. Many folks were going to Ivy League schools. Many folks, were coming down who had money, networks that could tap in and support support SNCC in the civil rights movement. And by bringing white volunteers down, it also situated it as a national and not solely a Southern Black issue. Situated racial segregation, racial inequity is not solely a problem for the South, but one that we should all be a part of solving. Many cons. First, some were worried, leadership was worried that white volunteers would dominate the program and fail to follow Black leadership. They felt that this would be less empowering for Black residents to have a bunch of white folks coming down to the South. They thought that because of the fact that white folks weren't maybe used to the culture and the norms of the South, that they might endanger themselves and others. And they also were concerned that their presence might mean harsher retaliation from white supremacists. So those are some of the reasons, and I'd love for us to listen to Charles Cobb. He's one of the leaders who was opposed to bringing white volunteers down to Mississippi.
Within SNCC, this idea of bringing down white middle class students from the North to help lead voter registration drives in Mississippi was actually controversial. It's controversial within SNCC. And Charles Cobb, in fact, early on, you opposed the idea of Freedom Center. You opposed bringing down white students from the North. What was the problem that you and some other members of SNCC had with this idea?
I think our objection or opposition to the summer project, unfortunately, has been racialized more than it should be. We were fundamentally opposed to bringing a large number of college students from the outside into Mississippi, essentially because we felt that we had been spending the last 2 or 3 years trying to cultivate grassroots that was still very fragile, and that this large number of students would essentially trample on those grassroots. They could do things more efficiently, and while that's good in one sense, it also takes possession of the movement away from the local people in another sense. We were organizers, not leaders, and our main concern was cultivating local leadership, and we were nervous about what it would mean to have 1,000 Northern college students, and we were talking around that number of 1,000 right from the beginning, come down south.
Funny thing is, you were from the outside too. You weren't from Mississippi. You were from Massachusetts.
Exactly. Mrs. Hamer, when I voiced objection, Mrs. Hamer,
Fannie Lou Hamer, yeah,
backed me up against the wall and said, "Well, Charlie, I'm glad you came down here. What's the problem with other people coming down here?" Now, what can I say to that? Well, nothing.
So
I said, "Yes, ma'am," and let it go. What that meant was.
You go to the next one. Thanks, Ivory. So there were many, spoiler, they decided to have the white students come down from the North. And there were many, many positives that came out of this. Mississippi summer contributed to the momentum for the passage of major legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It increased national awareness of the country's racial injustice and inequity. It radicalized a generation of activists. I mean, these folks, and then especially these folks coming down from the North, it opened their eyes to realities of, yes, they were seeing racism in the North because racism is everywhere in this country and always has been. But in the South, they were getting a taste of reality in a different way. And I say that in part because I moved to Mississippi for a year, and it was one of the most eye-opening experiences of my life, and one of the most valuable experiences of my life, both for the racism that I saw and the resistance and the organizing that I saw and got to be a part of. So I know that when these students returned back north, and many of them decided to stay in Mississippi because uh, they were so committed to the cause, that it changed the remainder of their life, the trajectory of their life. Maybe not all, maybe some saw it as a temporary like reprieve from ordinary life, but for many, it altered the way that they looked at the world. And I think for folks, local folks in Mississippi too, and activists of SNCC and leader of SNCC, getting to meet these folks who were coming down from the north must have been eye-opening as well. I think so. There were many positives. It definitely reduced both white and black folks' biases of each other as they got to spend more time together. And you can read about that. There's a book just called Freedom Summer. I'm looking because I know I have it on my shelf, but I can share that later. And you can hear kind of the personal narratives of volunteers and leaders as they were experiencing Freedom Summer. But we also want to talk about the challenges. So the positives and the negatives. So in this book by Breens, she writes, most of the whites were well-meaning, hardworking, committed, and courageous, but some were insensitive, arrogant, overbearing, and guilty, and their privilege often made them unaware of these traits. Inevitably, some Black SNCC workers felt invaded, inadequate, resentful, and angry. So over time, Black movement leaders, a faction, not all, some believed till the end in staying as a multiracial coalition. But there was a faction, there was a split in SNCC where some Black leaders believed that the presence of white volunteers was robbing Southern Blacks of gaining dignity and self-determination and empowerment. And so we see kind of in the midst of Freedom Summer and after this kind of trending away for some of the leaders, a trending away from interracialism and also nonviolence. And Stokely Carmichael was part of that faction. And if you go to the next one, you'll see him. And he became the chair of SNCC in 1966, beating John Lewis. And it's kind of a wild moment where it could have gone either way because John Lewis won originally the vote to be the chair of SNCC. He'd been it before and he originally won to be it again, but they decided that there weren't enough folks who had voted. And so they woke everybody up during a staff retreat at 2 a.m. and brought everybody back to vote again. And when they voted for a second time, Stokely Carmichael was the winner. And a month later, he was calling for Black Power. And this is in Greenwood, Mississippi. And this was an incredible, and it spread like wildfire, advocating for racial dignity, empowerment, cultural pride, community control, and the potential use of violence for self-defense, many aspects, key markers of the Black Panther Party. And so at the same time as this faction is wondering whether having less whites a part of this movement would be more empowering for local Black folks, they're also, the bigger almost concern is whether integrated organizations must wait and whites should focus on organizing and mobilizing in white communities. Because, well, I'll say that, and let's listen to Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons. I'm so sorry. Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons. She was one of the leaders of SNCC's Atlanta Project, and she talks about this.
But another important point is that after Mississippi Summer, the racial composition of SNCC changed because so many of the white volunteers wanted to commit their lives to full-time. And so the organization expanded and the numbers changed in terms of the ratio. Now, the Atlanta office, the national headquarters, had a significant number of whites. And one of the problems that fed the feeling that whites needed to go and organize in the white community was that we would have to go there and often ask for resources and justify them to white members. And so we'd say, well, wait a minute, is this a Black organization or what? You know, and we had some difficulty after we got Julian elected, as we continued being a project, wanting to and attacking these deep-seated issues that we still have not addressed. We had to justify ourselves often to predominantly white. So we would say, but wait a minute, you know, you guys need to go into the white community. So what happened was it got projected as an anti-white thing. Now, there was some racial tension, but it was about, we cannot change the white community. Possibly you can. Maybe you can't, but clearly we can't even go into the white community to try to even organize. So that's really what our position was. You go and work in your communities. We should run the Black movement, and we need to see where we want to go. We noticed that, you know, if you played a Malcolm X tape like we would do, not a tape, but a record, we sort of created some innovative ways of trying to organize. So we started we had a truck and we put a loudspeaker on it, and we'd go to a vacant lot. And the way we could get people out, we'd have food, hot dogs, and then we'd get the people to come so we could talk to them about registering to vote and stuff. But we noticed if you played, you know, somebody like Malcolm, the people would just come out and listen. And so it was like, do the people want integration, or is this what the Black leadership and under white direction have always said is the solution? So we began looking at some of these issues, and this spreads through SNCC. So you have Bob Moses and his group, who are now not in Mississippi anymore. They are working in Lowndes County, Alabama, along with Stokely. So a lot is going on, and then people have gone to Africa. SNCC folk, a number of them went there. And so some people were saying, well, maybe really African Americans need to go back to Africa. So, you know, all of this is swirling around. And when Stokely stands up in Mississippi and says Black Power, and this catches fire with the people, so many factors start impinging on what was happening in the movement. Jim was losing control because he clearly did not approve of any of this, in spite of what he later went on to do, you know, but at that time. And of course, John Lewis, who was deeply religious and believed deeply in nonviolence, not as a tactic, but as a way of life, being a minister and all. He opposed just talking about, you know, Black power and all of this. So there was a real division that came to exist within SNCC around these issues.
All right, great. Thanks. So this division happens, and at the staff retreat in 1967, SNCC does a vote about whether or not to exclude white SNCC workers. And as you could hear from Gwendolyn, like there were definitely, people were on both sides of this and felt strongly about it. But only Black members participated in the vote, and by a vote of 1, whites were excluded. So the ending vote was 18 for keeping whites in the organization and 19 for excluding whites. And I'll talk about the end of SNCC follows fairly quickly after that, but for a variety of reasons in 1968. And in 1969, the Rainbow Coalition begins. And in many ways, the Rainbow Coalition addressed many of the interracial issues that SNCC was facing. So just to give context, in Chicago, Illinois, the mayor Daley ran a corrupt political machine. Chicago was one of the most racially, residentially, politically segregated cities in America. So cross-class unity was non-existent. And the Rainbow Coalition was a coalition of the Illinois Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, a group of Puerto Ricans and Latinos, and the Young Patriots, who were a group of Appalachian white migrants. And all of these leaders were young. They were in their late teens and early 20s. And you're not seeing a lot of women in these photos, despite the fact that there were women in all three of these organizations. But you had sexism, and you had the leadership often being relegated to men. Not always. There were women leaders and all three, but often the default was male leader. So this group comes together, led by the Black Panther Party, who unite these forces by talking to these different groups about what they have in common, what they're all struggling with. They're struggling with political corruption. They're struggling with police brutality, being targeted by police. They're struggling with poverty. They're struggling with urban renewal being used as an excuse to push out BIPOC from the area, to push out poor whites and Blacks and Latinos and Puerto Ricans, and to make way for middle class whites. So they're struggling with gentrification. And the Black Panthers become a model organization for these two groups. And they help them start the same type of community service programs that the Black Panthers were offering in their own neighborhoods. So each group starts providing the free breakfast for children, medical centers, food pantries, community daycares to support and organize their communities. Like, these groups come together and they start empowering and organizing their communities in new ways. And they strategize together about ways that their communities can be healthier and more vibrant, and also fight those in power who are trying to keep them down. And sometimes you could see Young Patriots would be at Black Panther events, and they'd be providing security for Black Panther speakers. Another example of an action that came out of this coalition was that the Young Lords created a committee to put pressure on school boards to improve schools in the area. So they were really of the mind of, if the people in power are going to continue to oppress and to continue to ignore and demean our struggles, then we're going to fight in our own ways to improve the livelihoods of our communities. And I'll talk about kind of the collapse of the Rainbow Coalition next week, but I'm going to hand it over to you, Ivory. Oh, just to say that they were really good buds, really, really good buds between kind of the leaders of these organizations. All right, yeah, you can. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, it is the complexities of having three different screens. Okay, so we are in the home stretch. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the contemporary examples of multiracial coalitions, and we cannot start there unless we address this person. This person is very near and dear to my heart because I was in high school when I got the news of the killing, and then also still in high school once things happened. If you are not aware of who this person is, this is Trayvon Martin. He was born February 5th, 1955, and was tragically killed February 26th in 2012. Ironically, after he was murdered, the very next day, or as that night, I started texting my friends and I said, hey, we all should wear hoodies to school because he was killed because he was walking home from the store with a hoodie on, and he had Skittles and a Arizona iced tea in his pocket. So why did this have to happen? What was the sense of it, and why wasn't there a global condemnation for something like this? Because I saw myself in Trayvon Martin as well. I remember when President Obama came out and said that that could have been my son. So why do I bring up Trayvon Martin? Okay, it is after his acquittal, his killer's acquittal. Give me a second. My computer is acting funny. But it's after his acquittal, after George Zimmerman, his murderer, after he was acquitted of the murder, Black Lives Matter is going to be founded. So in 2013, you are going to have this organization that was deemed to challenge the systematic and systemic racism, police brutality, racial injustice through activism, through education, as well as policy advocacy. All right. So today we hear the BLM, right? I encourage everybody to say Black Lives Matter, because when we start to throw acronyms like diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we say just DEI, that gives more credit to the opposition than naming what it is that the cause is, right? So after that, go here. So they're going to maintain a significant presence in the United States, and you start to feel a uprising of activism. So you had murders of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner at the hands of police in 2014. So you're going to steady see this drumbeat. Okay, you're going to experience this drumbeat of what it means to be activists in the 21st century. A lot of people liken this to the modern day civil rights movement. And I couldn't agree more, because this is kind of what got me into the fold. So sustaining that momentum, there were countless amounts of violence towards African-American, and not just African-American men, but you had women like Sandra Bland who were murdered for no reason in these late 2010s. So the momentum is going to be sustained, right? So we hear Black Lives Matter and we associate that with what we're going to talk about here in a second. But the idea of Black Lives Matter is rooted in liberation. It's rooted in the support from not just African Americans and Black people, but you had Latinos, Asians, Indigenous people, Arab people, you had white people, all communities coming together in one of the largest protests, one of the largest movements in US history since the civil rights era. All right. What happened to that? So obviously we're all at home during COVID. Those institute and educator ambassadors from Minneapolis shared their personal stories about dealing with the fallout of the murder of George Floyd in 2020. We all saw it, right? But what happened was a global, interracial, multiracial coalition coming together. So these are images from all over the world saying the same thing, echoing the same chant. All right. Look at how beautiful this is. From Tokyo to England to Scotland, you have people saying the same message, Black Lives Matter. And the question comes back is, well, don't all lives matter? I don't disagree with that either. But the one thing that I did see during this whole time was an illustration of a fire, a house being on fire, and the fire department putting that fire out and surging resources to that home. And it had somebody standing in their front yard, house intact, saying, but don't all houses matter? Absolutely. But when there's a house on fire, we should take care of that, because what happens? It could explode, the fire could spread, all types of things, right? This is not a divisive concept. If American history, if Thomas Jefferson, if those founders would have allowed that to stay, that passage to stay in the Declaration of Independence, we need to say Black Lives Matter, but it seems as though he knew it. John Brown knew it. The rest of the people that we have learned about, the SNCCs, all of these organizations, they knew it. And we should still know that today. And we should work towards that today. That should be all of our charge, because what we are seeing right now is very scary. There are children that are growing up that saw lynchings as children. There are children right now that are growing up seeing this type of division. And if they don't get the real history, they'll believe that that's okay. So we talk about contemporary. Really quick, we're going to talk about the Fox, Deja Fox and Zora Mamdani. All right. This has nothing to do with the political spectrum. This is about people coming together for a common cause, right? For a common cause. You have a multiracial coalition. It still exists. The message has to be clear for people to follow it. Okay. So with that, I want to advertise our next thing, and don't go anywhere. This is not log off time. Okay. So Sunday we have our banned book club. This is put on by the Educators for Democracy. You see the times there, 5 PST, 8 EST. Whether you have read the book or not, Okay, we invite you to come. We're talking about the book Just Mercy, written by Brian Stevenson. For those of you that have been on learning tours with us, going down to Montgomery, you've been to the Legacy Museum. Brian Stevenson has his imprint all over Montgomery, and we invite you to come to be a part of the discussion. We would love to have you there. And my challenge to you all for lecture 2, which will be next week, same time next week, bring somebody else. Okay, bring somebody with you, right? Because the way that we stand up and do something, right? The same way that the John Browns, the Bacon's Rebellions, Gabriel's Rebellion, the way that we do something in this moment is coming together to strategize, to organize, and then act, right? And we cannot do that alone. So we invite you to bring more people in, right? Not for our sake, but for the country, right? For your community. Let's start local for your community. So again, as we stated at the beginning, we're going to be dissecting the different understandings of truth, right? We're going to look at the different historical narratives, and then we're going to see how those things have perpetuated thus far, and then how do we bridge those gaps, right? That is our goal. So before we close, I want to go back to what James Baldwin said about segregation. He was very clear that he's not blaming people for not understanding, but if you're not near someone, you don't know. I grew up in a predominantly Black environment. I went to University of Kentucky for my freshman year of high school, or for my freshman year of college, and I was mind blown because I'd never been around an environment like that. And with that comes stereotypes. With that comes all types of biases, which are fair. But when you have the truth, when you are armed with truth, when you get to know someone, that should calm a lot of that angst that does arise when you are in an unfamiliar place or something causes discomfort. And like I tell my future teachers, my students today, it is not my job to figure out what makes you uncomfortable. You have to do that on your own will, and then make sure that that does not become someone else's problem. My issues should not be your issues, right? That is my work to do. Now, as we move forward with the last thing, this is a coalition that is worth remembering, but it does not come without warning, okay? So I want us all to really soak in the reality that once was. And then I want everybody to feel charged to have an answer of how do we get that back? Because I don't believe it's impossible, right? If people could go from being enslaved in this country to us being able to do this lecture and talk about this, then anything should be possible. And I truly believe that. I tell my son that all the time, anything is possible. So I'm going to play this. We're going to take a second. I want you to absorb all the things. I want you to pay attention to the shifts. Pay attention to the coalition that you see. Pay attention to the various faces. And then pay attention to the shift.
I'm not getting sound.
Is anyone out there
There we go.
who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible? Change gonna come. Who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time? Who still questions the power of our democracy? Tonight is your answer. Change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. The answer told by lines that stretched around schools and churches in numbers this nation has never seen, because they believed that this time must be different, that their voices could be that difference.
Women couldn't vote and Black people couldn't vote, and now there's a Black president running. That's just amazing.
You can talk and say how things should change and things should be this way or that way, and you can do here and there, but it counts when you come in and vote for it and you stand up for what you say.
Americans who sent a message to the world that we have never been just a collection of individuals or a collection of red states and blue states. We are and always will be the United States of America.
It felt like the bureaucracy of government had taken all of our hope away, and it feels like it's back.
Obama kind of scares me. It's, I think we might be headed towards a socialist nation. We're going to have a president for the first time in the history of the United States that hangs out with terrorists, that bombed the Pentagon, New York City Police Department, and at least knows these people and went to their house. I think in 4 years, yeah, I agree. We could very well be a welfare state. And we're all sitting in here and it's 1984 all over again. Or the government signs us a job, make sure we have health care, make sure everything's at the minimum. Well, I want more than the minimum, or at least a chance to try to get more than the minimum. I want that more than me. I can barely make my own living, but my grandson, he's smart. He might be able to do something with his life.
I think it's a sad day for our country, but hopefully in 4 years we can,
No, 2 years, Congress.
hopefully in 2 years we can take back Congress and really, minimize the negative impact he has. Hey, I'm the guy on record saying he is the black Muslim Antichrist. 2 years, this country's out, Republicans come back all the way.
Again, focusing on the positive, right? That coalition that we saw, right? It almost gives me goosebumps because if we had that type of unity today, there's no hatred. There was no hatred coming from that. That was the example of what possibility could be like if enough people of a multiracial coalition come together and make a decision that we are going to do our duty. We're going to do our duty, fulfill that. Not just our promise to exercise our rights to vote, but to come together for a common cause. As a prelude to what we're going to talk about next week, though, see the shift in tone. That man said the black Muslim Antichrist, he said, I'm on record. He said that he was hanging out with bombers and terrorists, and not to mention that, it was his presidency, it was under his administration that took out Osama bin Laden, right? But that's besides the point. Think about what that moment was like in 2008 for people operating under a different understanding of the United States. I doubt that those men understood what Bacon's Rebellion was about, what the idea of Fannie Lou Hamer and what she stood for, what Freedom Summer and Freedom Schools was all about. This is why the importance of both education and truth matter if we are going to win. We are the answer to what this moment is today, because we could make the case that what those men were saying in those clips is a lot of what we hear now, but it is incredibly mainstream. So it's going to be up to all of us, right? Up to you to bring a few, not just you, but bring a few. Put that on the t-shirt or something, right? But to bring a few people to come back, right? Because we want to not only talk about the backlashes of all of this progress, this beautiful progress that we saw that has been made once before, but we have to be real about the reality of how much this country has a tendency to have a backlash to certain progress, right? Devin, anything from you as we close out?
I mean, no, we're ending it on that. Thank you, Ivory.
Thank you. Well, folks, we appreciate you showing up for tonight. I'm not sure, are there any questions in the Q&A at all? I don't see that at all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here just in case.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, we've got about 5 minutes left and we can answer those. I'll drop our emails. Maybe we can drop our emails in the chat. And if you want to, you might want to marinate on this. And if you want to send us any thoughts or questions, please feel free. I'll write mine. I'm not quite sure what yours is, Ivory. This is a little different from mine, if you wouldn't mind adding that too. Yeah. But we just really appreciate you all spending the evening with us. And we hope that, this was, that you got a few nuggets of insight or just interest from what we shared. Perfect. So we got one question. Can I get a list of those suffragists? Absolutely. Oh, love it, Jim. The coalition of the caring needs to persist beyond elections. Very true.
Absolutely. And that can start today. That can start next session. That can start after the series, right?
I love how y'all feel about Harris. And I'm in agreement. And Wendy, thank you so much. All right,
Yeah.
y'all.
All right. Same time, same day, next week. We appreciate you all showing up. Not just you, but bring a few. And we look forward to seeing you all.
Yeah, absolutely. And Marilyn, send me, if you wouldn't mind, send me that person's contact information, the one who was part of SNCC. We'd love to chat with them.
For sure.
All right. Wonderful, y'all. All right. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
See you all.
Bye.